Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of many HTI international webinars. This is a webinar presented by Pharmerit, and it's called the Is There Potential for a Joint HTA in Europe? Before we get started, we did just want to display the disclaimer just to make sure that everyone on the line is aware that this is a sponsored session. So I will pause for a moment right now and just allow you to read through the disclaimer just to make sure you're aware of all of the components. Excellent. And before we get started, I also wanted to mention that none of you that are attending will actually be able to ask any questions through your audio. This is a webcast only, so please do use the functionality within the webinar software to ask questions. What we will be doing is we will be consolidating those and sending them off to our partners at Pharmerit to be able to spend some time at the end of the session going through the questions. So please do feel free to post questions as the session is ongoing. So I'm going to hand it over to Rosemary and team right now. So Rosemary, I'm just going to change the presenter to you.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Are you able to see the title slide?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Is There Potential for a Joint HTA in Europe? An evaluation of EUnetHTA joint clinical assessments and national appraisals in oncology. I'm Rosemary, and on behalf of Pharmerit, thank you for joining. I am presenting today along with my colleagues Emmanuel, Amrita, and Christina. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we will begin with a small introduction of Pharmerit, why we think this topic is of relevance and of special interest to us. We tell you a bit about, give you an overview rather of the EUnetHTA Joint Action 3. We provide and give you an idea of our research objectives, methodology, and approach, and then go into our findings, specifically on similarities, differences of joint clinical assessments within the Joint Action 3 over time. A deep dive into joint clinical assessments and national HTA and how they have been, what they've looked at, which we'll see in a bit. And Christina will wrap up with some insights on differing perspectives on the proposal by the European Commission. We bring this all together with implications of our findings on the potential in terms of opportunities and challenges for joint HTA in Europe. For the last 10 minutes or so, we'll open it up to Q&A. But like Chris said, feel free to send in your questions, type them in the chat window, and we'll compile them and respond at the end of the session. At Pharmerit, our mission is to improve patient access to medical care through evidence worldwide. Pharmerit was established in the year 2000 in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. And since then, we have offices up and running in the US, so Bethesda, Boston, Berlin, and Shanghai, recently New York, and now very recently Mumbai and Oxford. We're spanning 3 continents and 7 locations. We're a total of 142 health economics and market access experts who specialize in strategic market access, modeling and meta-analysis, real-world evidence and data analytics, and patient-centered outcomes. Working end-to-end on product development support in different therapeutic areas. And part of what we do also involves HTA submissions, starting from the scoping and discussions to the dossier submission. A bit about the EUnetHTA Joint Action 3. So EUnetHTA was established with the view to support collaboration between European HTA organizations, which, as we know, are quite diverse, and to bring added value to healthcare systems at the European, national, regional level, adhering to the EU values of efficiency, sustainability, subsidiarity, and the best quality of evidence. Over the years, EUnetHTA has evolved, and we're now at the phase that's known as Joint Action 3, which is where we're implementing a sustainable model for scientific technical cooperation on HTA in Europe. EUnetHTA is a joint venture among more than 80 different agencies from 30 different countries in Europe. And the approach is divided. So the coordination committee, the overall coordination is by the Dutch Directorate of Healthcare, the Zorg Institute Nederland, or the ZIN as we know it. And then you have all these different work packages, all the way from dissemination through to implementation, which is led by the other main HTA bodies. At the core of the EUnetHTA model is what's known as the HTA Core Model. And for those of you who work with HTA submissions or are part of payer organizations or the industry, you're familiar, of course, with all these different components of HTA, starting with the health problem and current use of technology, description, technical characteristics, safety and effectiveness, and then we go into costs and economic evaluation. So within the HTA Core Model, the first 4 domains are what fall under the purview of the joint clinical assessment, and the last 5 domains remain with the member states. Okay. Here I present an overview. This is from the EUnetHTA website, of course. These are the assessments that have been conducted under the Joint Action 3. And I want to highlight here these 3 products, which we included as part of our, for our research purposes. So midostaurin, regorafenib, and alisanza or alectinib. The joint clinical assessment is only as valuable as uptake and use by the member states. So here we provide an overview of the extent of use and uptake. I want to wrap up the introductory part of this webinar with a few points about the EC proposal. So we know that the European Commission proposal was given, the Parliament gave the green light in October 2018, with so highlighting that the focus would be on permanent cooperation on common tools, procedures, early dialogues, and joint clinical assessments. So where does that leave us? Well, what we wanted to do with this research, so we used a very systematic approach. We defined our objectives, extracted the parameters, and defined extraction parameters a priori. And our objective here is to provide an overview of how EUnetHTA joint clinical assessments have evolved over time. Then we take a deep dive into how the scope of evidence is similar or different between the joint clinical assessments and appraisals performed by national HTA bodies in oncology. And we'd also like to present early insights into whether the outcomes that drive access decision-making at the national level have been considered in the joint clinical assessments. I just want to put it out there at the outset that we are, of course, these are early insights, and these are based on it's only based on 3 products, right? So conclusions need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because EUnetHTA by itself is still working on their process, and it's not really a hardcore assessment. It's more HTA information that would feed into national appraisal. So we just want to keep that, we just want to bear that in mind as we go along with the discussion. So within our scope were 3 products: regorafenib, which is indicated for hepatocellular carcinoma, midostaurin for the indication for acute myeloid leukemia, and alectinib, which is indicated for ALK-positive advanced non-small cell lung cancer. For the evaluation on the site, we chose 3 HTA agencies. So we chose France, Germany, and the UK. And we looked at how they have differently chosen or assessed the trials, comparators, how they've assessed efficacy, safety outcomes, what relevance or what importance they've given to indirect treatment comparisons, and how they've used patient engagement in their assessments. So with that introduction and overview on our approach, I will now hand it over to Emanuela to walk you through some preliminary findings.
Great. In the following section, I would like to present to you the outcomes of the comparative analysis performed across the 3 available EUnetHTA pharmacological assessments as introduced by Rosemary. We will look at the body of evidence, the use of indirect treatment comparison and patient engagement, and the details regarding results used across the 3 assessments. Again, it is important to stress that the assessments have been performed by 3 different authoring and co-authoring agencies across Europe. Therefore, any trends should be interpreted with caution. Here we can see the body of evidence included in the 3 assessments. The graph clearly shows that over time an increasing body of evidence has been included to also enable indirect treatment comparison. The red circles indicate the comparator trials which were included in the EUnetHTA assessments for the indirect treatment comparison, as stated in the slide, through network meta-analysis. Another element to highlight at the bottom of the slide is the change in comparators used, probably with the aim of broadening the scope of the assessment to accommodate the different member states' needs. In this slide, we present an overview of the changes in the degree of implementation and use of indirect treatment comparison and patient engagement. With regard to indirect treatment comparison, we clearly see a trend that goes from no ITC performed in the case of regorafenib to an ITC performed indirect treatment comparison performed in the case of midostaurin, but with insufficient evidence to provide comments on the comparison. And finally, in the case of alectinib, we have an indirect treatment comparison performed and data actually used to comment on the indirect comparison. However, here the results are to be considered again with caution. Similar trends are seen with regards to patient engagement. We go from no patient engaged in the case of regorafenib to 1 patient engaged, but with limited specific details regarding the engagement and the outcome of such engagement in the case of midostaurin. And finally, in the case of alectinib, we have also 1 patient engaged who provided inputs on the most essential aspects from a patient point of view, in this case, such as life expectancy, side effects, and financial implication, as you can see on the slide. Interestingly, recent developments seem to suggest an increased interest from EUnetHTA in enlarging and enriching patient engagement for future assessment. The 2 figures on the left of this slide indicate the frequency of use of efficacy outcomes on the top left and safety outcomes on the bottom left across the 3 assessments. For efficacy outcomes, we can say that overall survival and health-related quality of life data have been used and are at the core of the analysis across all 3 assessments. Progression-free survival has been used in 2 out of the 3 assessments, and there is heterogeneity with regards to the remaining efficacy outcomes included, probably again due to the diverse disease area and the availability of evidence. With regard to safety outcomes, bottom left, the image bottom left of the slide, the picture is more heterogeneous. Nonetheless, there is some continuity in the use of adverse events, serious adverse events, and discontinuation due to adverse events outcomes, particularly in the latest 2 assessments, midostaurin and alectinib. However, overall, we notice heterogeneity in both capturing and describing safety outcomes. On the right side of the slide, the table provides an overall description of survival, health-related quality of life, safety, and indirect treatment comparison results across the 3 assessments. Overall, all assessments capture clearly the impact of efficacy survival outcomes provided by the included evidence with the respective references to the trials and evidence. We also noticed an increasing interest and focus on health-related quality of life outcomes. It is visible, for example, from the use of terms such as limited or missing evidence that were stressed in the conclusion parts of both regorafenib and midostaurin. Finally, as previously mentioned, there is increased use and focus specifically on network meta-analysis. Indeed, in the case, we go from the case of regorafenib when we have no network meta-analysis performed to the case of midostaurin when we have network meta-analysis performed but with serious limitation and insufficient evidence, to the case of alectinib where network meta-analysis was performed and outcomes were used to inform the assessment but with cautions and limitations. And in this specific case, specific attention was given to lack of adjustment of patient characteristics for the network meta-analysis and the dependencies regarding the heterogeneity assumptions. Overall, these were the most relevant elements highlighted from the comparison performed across the three Joint Action 3 EUnetHTA assessments. And now I will hand it over to my colleague Amrita for the next session.
Hello, everyone. In the next few slides, we will go through the joint assessments of the same three oncology products in the context of their national appraisals from France, Germany, and the UK. Within the scope of this objective, we will closely examine the choice of trials and comparators, the efficacy and safety endpoints that were considered in the assessments and the appraisals, and the use of indirect treatment comparisons and patient engagement activities. But before we go into the scope, I'd like to give you an overview of the evidence sources that we have used for the evaluation. So on this slide, you can see the full overview. We've looked at three products as was also mentioned earlier. So we're looking at regorafenib, midostaurin, and alectinib. These were chosen because of the availability of the joint clinical assessment. We then went on to identify the appraisals from the websites of HAAS, IQWIG, or GB as relevant, and NICE. I do want to point out two things regarding evidence availability. The first is for the case of regorafenib, there was no assessment available for Germany. And the second is with the case of midostaurin, which has an orphan drug status. What this implies is that in Germany, added benefit is already proven by marketing authorization. Therefore, we've used the GBA report for the evaluation instead of the assessment by IQWIG. With this context, we will first look at the trials and comparators that were included in the joint assessments and the appraisals. On this slide, we provide an overview of the trials and comparators that were considered in the joint assessments and the national appraisals. So what you see here is the three, you have the list of trials and comparators listed for all three products. And the tick mark indicates if the trial was included, and the cross, of course, if it was not included in the appraisal. Now, the overall observation is that the clinical assessments have a broader scope compared to the national appraisals. There are four main observations with the use of trials and comparators that I will talk about. The first is that the joint assessments have included, at the very least, the same trials and the comparators as the appraisals from France, Germany, and the UK. In both the joint assessments and the appraisal, the pivotal phase 3 trial is used as a source for direct clinical evidence. So if you see the case of regorafenib, we're looking at the resource trial. For midostaurin, it's RATIFY, and for alectinib, we're looking at the ALEX trial. And the last point is that over time, the scope of trials and comparators has become more complete. The context of complete is of course, if we take the outlook of the national appraisals. With this overview of trials and comparators, we'll take a deep dive into the use of efficacy endpoints. So on this slide, you will see an overview of the efficacy endpoints used in the joint assessments and the appraisals. Before I go into the overall findings, I want to describe for you what you see on this slide. Our objective with this assessment was to link the use of efficacy endpoints used in the joint assessments and the appraisals. So to do that, what we've done is we've used a horizontal bar which lists out the endpoints reported in the joint assessments. The endpoints that contributed to the conclusions of the joint assessment are marked in color within the bar. And after this, we've used the bar as a reference to map the endpoints that were considered for decision-making in the national appraisals. This is indicated by an icon of the flag of the country under the listed endpoint. This overview is presented for all three products, starting with the oldest one, regorafenib, on the top, and the latest, alectinib, at the bottom. Coming to the findings, we see that there is good alignment in the choice of efficacy endpoints considered in the JCAs and those used for decision-making by the HTA bodies of France, Germany, and the UK. What do I mean by good alignment? We see that across all three products, overall survival, progression-free survival, health-related quality of life, and time to progression have been considered in both joint assessments and for decision-making in the national appraisals. But beyond these endpoints, we saw that there are small differences. This can be observed for the latest joint assessment of alectinib. Additional endpoints were considered by France and Germany. In the case of France, objective response rate was considered in addition to the 4 endpoints that I've mentioned earlier. In the case of IQWIG, morbidity-related endpoints was also considered, such as elevation of symptoms. This is indicative of the focus of IQWIG in terms of endpoints, of using endpoints of patient relevance. We'll now move on to an overview of the safety endpoints. On this slide, you see a similar setup of depicting the endpoints that have been used and those considered relevant to decision making. Again, this overview is presented for all three products. But in contrast to the observations that we saw for efficacy, there is much more heterogeneity in the use of safety endpoints. Over time, though, we see that there is more alignment in the joint assessment and national appraisals. This can particularly be seen in the case of alectinib, where we see that the joint clinical assessment looked at all of the endpoints that all the three HTA bodies have considered or used in their appraisals. Now, beyond efficacy and safety, we've looked at 2 additional topics in the context of evidence, which is the use of indirect treatment comparison and patient engagement. I'll first speak to the use of indirect treatment comparisons. We see that ITCs were performed in 2 of 3 JCAs compared to the national appraisals where no ITC was performed. This is due to the availability of evidence from head-to-head trials. This is as far as we can comment on the use of ITC because a lack of ITC in the appraisals limited any further comparison, especially to the methodology that was undertaken in the ITC presented in the JCA. With regards to patient engagement, and this has been mentioned before, it was done in the more recent JCAs and also been done in the national HTAs. Of course, EUnetHTA, with the JCAs, there is an increasing focus on patient engagement activities. If we look at our findings together, there are coherent observations, but also uncertainties. I'll talk about these by topic. We'll start with the choice of trials and comparators. From our analysis, we see that the joint assessment seemed to accommodate the scope of national appraisals. An important question is whether the assessment will consider all member states' standards of care. If the answer to this is yes, how will this be done and agreed upon before any assessments are carried out? With regards to the use of endpoints, we see an initial good level of agreement with regards to efficacy. This is promising as efficacy is known to drive decisions about actual benefit by the HOS and IQWIG, but there was little to no consistency regarding the use of safety endpoints. Adding to this was that national appraisals from France and Germany also considered additional endpoints for decision making. This makes the situation of acceptability of endpoints covered in the joint assessments for national appraisals controversial at this stage. With regards to the use of ITC, we see that there are differences, but mainly driven by the fact that direct evidence is available against the relevant comparators. If direct evidence was not available, then the inconsistent use of ITC would likely become a source of debate across countries. I state this because from our own research last year, we saw that more than 80% of ITCs were not accepted in Germany. The fact that ITCs were done in 2 of 3 JCAs does pose an important question. Will the JCA's approach towards ITCs be stricter, like that of the IQWIG in Germany, or more accepting, like that of the NICE in the UK? With regards to patient engagement, there is an increasing use of patient engagement activities, which we think, to an extent, that if it does increase, the endpoints of patient relevance will be integrated into the JCAs. I want to close by some final remarks about our findings. So when we've looked at everything together, this first evaluation reveals a trend towards more homogeneity than less. but important differences remain and will need addressing if the full potential of joint HTA in Europe is to be realized. I will now let Christina talk you through the different perspectives of the member states.
Yes, so as we have seen in our analysis, different countries have differing requirements for HTA, for example, regarding the endpoints of clinical trials. Thus, for industry, joint clinical assessments at EU level, as they are proposed by the regulation of the European Commission, will have obvious advantages. However, looking at country level, some member states are strongly opposing the proposed regulation on joint HTA. Basically, there is one major concern, and that is the obligation for every member state to adopt the assessments carried out at EU level, because this means that any individual or any complementary assessment will be prohibited to take place at national level. We would now like to give you a brief summary of the legal concerns that France, Germany, Poland and Czech Republic have officially expressed, and then we would also like to share some details on the critical feedback from Germany regarding the EU proposal. So the main point of criticism of these four countries is that the proposed regulation is not in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity of the European Union. This principle of subsidiarity is established in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union in order to define which powers are within the responsibility of the EU and what responsibilities remain at member state level. According to EU treaties, health policy and the organization and the delivery of healthcare is a responsibility of the member states, and the task of the EU is to promote collaboration between member states in terms of public health policies. However, the clinical assessment of new health technologies is very closely related to health economic aspects like reimbursement decisions and pricing. Thus, the European JCA will have an impact on the organization and delivery of healthcare for each member state. So, to conclude, although the joint assessments are not considering any economic aspects of HTA, they will have impacts that interfere with the competencies of the member states. The proposed regulation also interferes with the so-called principle of proportionality, because according to the critique, the advantages to transfer HTA to EU level are not sufficiently demonstrated in the proposed regulation. Moreover, the regulation stipulates so-called delegated and implementing acts, which will define future procedures and methods of joint clinical assessments. However, for now, no detailed information is provided, and the four countries postulate more clarity and transparency. Speaking of lack of clarity regarding future methods of JCA, we would like to present you now an overview of the main points of criticism Germany has on the proposed EU regulation. So as we have seen in our analysis of assessments of the EU3, Germany has a clear focus on patient-relevant outcomes as reflected in the morbidity endpoints. However, the question, what is patient-relevant, is still a point of discussion within German HTA and will certainly bring up a discussion between all the European HTA agencies. And that is why Germany insists that there will be a thorough definition on future methods and that all countries agree upon them. And along with this goes that the highest quality standards will be applied in European joint assessments. Another very critical point in the view of Germany is that joint clinical assessments would need to take into account the specific context of the health systems and also the treatment landscapes of each country. So, for example, future joint clinical assessments need to take into account that the assessments will be used for different purposes in the countries. In Germany, for example, they are only used to assess added benefit, but in other countries, the clinical assessments will be needed for cost-effectiveness analyses. And also regarding the specific context of each country, a major issue for joint clinical assessment is the choice of the appropriate comparator treatment. Because naturally, the comparator treatment for assessing a new health technology differs between countries, mostly due to the different medical and also financial context. And obviously, the choice of the comparator treatment will also have a great influence on pricing or price negotiations. A third important aspect for Germany is the distinction between assessment and the appraisal procedures. So while for the assessment, the available clinical data and evidence will be analyzed, the appraisal should then evaluate the findings of the assessment, and additionally, the appraisal should take into account the treatment landscape and also other specific aspects for each country. Eventually, it is essential in a German point of view that the future procedures of joint HTA are set at a high standard. So concretely, Germany claims a high level of transparency with assessment reports and also manufacturers' dossiers being publicly available. And regarding independency, the coordination group of HTA organizations shall have a leading role in JCA, and the role of the European Commission should be limited to administrative support. Moreover, it is important that decisions will be taken by consensus or at least by qualified majority. So this was a brief overview of some critical views and discussion points regarding the proposal of the European Commission. And now we will go back to Rosemary.
Thanks, Christina. So I hope we are still holding your attention. We've arrived at the last few slides of the presentation, where we will attempt to bring together all our the discussion we've had so far. Although I think Amrita did a good summary, and Emmanuel as well, of where we're going with the joint clinical assessments. So as a next step, EUnetHTA has published what's called the EPL, or the EUnetHTA prioritization list. And if you can spot, you already know then, if you can spot products that you're working on or are concerned with, then then you already know, you should already know it by now, because this is the list that was drawn from the Horizon scan based on anticipated date of CHMP opinion, and working backwards which products, which indications could go in for a joint clinical assessment. And I believe manufacturers are being contacted about whether they would like to participate. Let's try and take a look at what works well if joint clinical assessments, if the EC regulation were to come in force, and what might need a bit of work. So in terms of the positives, having a joint approach to clinical assessments, to HTA, does allow member states to free up and reallocate resources to measure performance of interventions in the wider healthcare system. So I'll quote here, and this is from the EUnetHTA magazine, I think from the fall edition last year, that the Austrian, it was the winter edition, I think, that the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Health Technology Assessment in Austria said that they've been able to use EUnetHTA assessment to replace national assessment report without making any major changes. In situations where amendments to the assessments are required, the process changes mean that only minor adjustments need to be done, like writing up a German summary or adding recommendations for decision makers. Therefore, this would build a more agile system with a quicker, well-defined process. And it does allow Europe as a whole to improve its negotiating power in influencing or informing global drug design and development if views can be aligned. Of course, that's the caveat, if views can be aligned on evidence requirements. So that kind of gives it a more, an FDA, although that's regulatory, of course, but more an ICR kind of feel, where you have a bigger body saying, okay, this is what we're looking for in clinical trials, for starters. The fact that this is now backed by an EC proposal does legalize things and give it more, let's say the administrative bureaucratic backing gets a bit stronger, which could be a good thing. On the flip side, the EU-HTA cooperation is unlikely to result in substantial cost savings, because of course at the national level, we would still need to get our local epi data and burden of illness and have the unmet need story and negotiate, conduct the cost effectiveness the economic evaluations, run the cost effectiveness budget impact models, negotiate pricing. So that's still a lot of work which needs to be done at the national and local levels. And importantly, clear guidance is required relating to what constitutes appropriate or acceptable quality of evidence and its assessment. So should it be left to the lead and the co-authors of a particular assessment? Well, probably not. So these are things which are still under discussion and which come back as a bit of critique. This again is from it's from the EUnetHTA website, really, the infographic. So this is what would be deemed important for the industry. Streamlined processes for clinical assessment in 27 countries and predictability of processes. Which brings us to another bunch of important open questions. What really constitutes quality of evidence, especially when you go ahead with a joint approach? Should we consider impact on burden of disease or take into account disease severity and then map what's quality of evidence for that subset of patients? How should we consider the level of unmet need? What would the ideal process and timing of joint assessments be to deliver robust quality of evidence? Should it be at the time of, so we did, Emmanuel and I were at the EUnetHTA forum, I think it was last month in April, and yeah, the discussions around what is a good timing to have a joint clinical assessment. Is it at CHMP or at marketing authorization? When is it inadequate data and then impossible to even think about it? And when is it so late that it's not efficient anymore? Then again, there are open questions about how is real-world evidence handled and how do we safeguard consistency in relative effectiveness assessment interpretation? How do we make sure that, okay, that the variables are limited? On the one hand, you have different authoring agencies, and on the other hand, you have multiple member states which are interpreting this data. So between, how much of data, how much of information is lost in the process? Will the same assessment requirements apply to medical devices as they do to pharmaceuticals? And how are we going to deal with the very current, the trending paradigm shifts in therapeutics with gene therapies, with ATMPs? How are we going to handle that? Are changes in the market adequately being brought to the table? So, I wish I could have something more finite, more solid for you to take away, but we believe our assessment helps to understand what's been done so far and where, what's going well and what probably needs a bit more work. But like I said, it's all work in progress. And well, having said that, feel free to contact us. You can write to Amrita or to myself. Do meet us if you're going to HTA Cologne. Amrita will be there, so do send a note, and she'll be happy to set up a meeting over coffee. And do stay tuned for our workshop in Berlin this autumn, where we will be discussing the upcoming German legislation on gene therapies and ATMPs. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar, and we will now address any questions that we've received. So I'm just looking at the list.
Right, so we've received a question regarding slide 33. The question reads, are those 4 countries the only countries opposing the European Commission proposal? So I'll invite Christina to take that question.
Yes, so Germany, France, Czech Republic, and Poland have filed a formal subsidiarity objection, so that's why we have presented those countries. But also other countries like Lithuania, Sweden, Slovakia, and Spain are very critical regarding the proposal. So in general, you can say that the larger countries are more critical than smaller countries. And but there are also countries that are really in favor of the proposed legislation, like Ireland or Portugal.
And we received another question regarding slide 30. What did you mean by patient engagement was accepted by IQWIG? This is just to clarify, it was not accepted. The slide shows whether it was done or not. In the case of Germany, it is mandatory to do so. So that's what the slide was indicating. Let's go through any more questions.
Yeah, I see a more basic question about will we share the slides? So yeah, sure. Feel free to drop us a note, or if you have already given your consent to share your email, if HTA already has that consent from you while you registered, I think there was a checkbox. Then yeah, we're happy to share the slides, of course. And I think yeah, I'm pretty sure actually that we also have a recording that's happening for the webinar. So we're also open to sharing the recording if that helps.
Perfect. I think that's it in terms of questions so far.
Excellent, Rosemary. There were a few other ones that were sent, but just a note that for those of you that did provide your consent, we will be providing follow-up with the slides and answers to the questions. So
how much time does a joint assessment need? But I think these are things better discussed because it also depends on the product in question. And yeah, we have a couple of our experiences we can share, but maybe this is better done. So I see another question now. Is the EUnetHTA opinion binding? If not, how do we ensure member states agree with the assessment? So that's the whole point. I mean, I think you've really hit the nail on the head. It's not binding yet. It's a recommendation, and of course, it's if the proposal comes through, then you know, then over a few years, when we've had guidelines in place to assess the quality of evidence, when we have a more robust process which is published, I think at that point the discussion will be open again about whether it needs to be a routine process and not voluntary anymore. But at this point, it's not binding. So it's way too early. I think there are a lot of administrative but also political factors which will come into play before we say that JCA is the golden rule. So we're not there yet. A question regarding ATMPs. Do HTA agencies of each country have a specific assessment or team for ATMP evaluations? Well, I would say this is out of scope for this discussion, but do join our workshop in Berlin and we'll focus on ATMPs. And so I see another comment. I'm going to read it out. 25 years ago, a very similar question was raised by national regulatory agencies regarding a single approval via the centralized procedure at EMA. Yeah, very good. Initially, the national regulatory agencies had a number of concerns. 5 to 10 years later, it was standard. At a German regulatory congress last Friday, I'm still reading, the Secretary of the German Ministry of Health clearly indicated his support to a joint assessment under certain conditions. A similar shift has been observed of a high level of concern / rejection to acceptable with conditions. What does this tell us regarding the future of joint assessments? In my view, the question should rather be the following. How should a joint HTA in the EU be conducted to implement and use, to enable use for national decision making? What are your thoughts? I think it's a very, it's a very pertinent comment because I think I've also been part of discussions where parallels have been drawn with how EMA came about. And if the political scenario allows, I think that's where this will go. But in the meanwhile, there are processes to be set in place. There's guidelines that need to be developed even. So, but then it's going on the right track. I think EUnetHTA in March published a template for a submission template, for instance. So now that might be used or maybe critiqued, and that could be revised, and then it's really work in progress. But it seems to be going, in my opinion, in the right direction. I want to ask about joint clinical assessments within the African context. That's very interesting. I wouldn't know. I don't know, Chris, are people allowed to, are participants allowed to speak? Because I'm happy to hear what the background to this question was.
Yeah, unfortunately with the webinar platform, we're not able to open up the audio line, but certainly we can pose to whoever asked that question to provide a bit more context that maybe can be shared.
Yeah, that would be great. And like I said, really just write to us, and we're happy to set up a call and talk further. It's what we're here for. So, in developing, another question here. In developing countries, if PharMerit has any report on that, and I also wanted to ask, okay, about our internal capacity building program. So let's take that offline, shall we? Maybe you can, like internships. Yes, we do. We are very open to having interns and, well, having you work with us. So yeah, just send us an email. I mean, I'm happy to follow up. Will you provide online training for a beginner who's interested in HTA? Sure. We do, well, PharMerit does university visits. We do trainings. We have events where we have students come over. You know, those were just completing their masters in relevant subjects. So yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for that. And you can also look up our website for more details, or you have our email addresses, so just you find us all there, so no secrets here. Do you know if IQWIG GBA is cooperative for EUnetHTA initiatives such as the JCA? I believe this is already covered in the presentation, but I don't know if Christina, do you want to pick this up? Do you have other comments?
Yeah, we have seen in the slides that IQWIG is participating in the EUnetHTA Joint Action 3, that it has taken some leading parts in it. So yes.
Yeah, definitely. They're not opposed to it as long as it's done, you know, in a way that it can be used for German purposes, I think.
Yes,
really,
and Germany is definitely in favor of cooperation in HTA.
Yes. What is the perspective of the pharma industry on the pros and cons of the JCA? It's a shame that those on the participants cannot comment on this, or we would have had a very interesting discussion. But from what I understand, the question is really about what does it involve in terms of the current way submissions are being done. So does it mean more work? Does it mean duplication of effort? Or would it be that, like, take Benelux, for example, yeah? So it's not, I mean, moving away from a core EUnetHTA, but Benelux was the cross-border collaboration between among Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and now also Ireland and Austria. And what am I forgetting? Yeah, Austria and Ireland. And how they reimbursed Spinraza for spinal muscular atrophy late last year as a group. So in these processes where you need to have joint negotiations, I think there's definitely value for the industry. Like when Biogen approached them, you just had to do one discussion over the table. So you have among the group of countries, you have one lead, of course, who will take the lead, but then there's others who are in assent, who agree to what is being discussed. So I think there's definitely efficiencies, but I will say but, because again, the caveat is it has to be done in a timely manner so that the process is not a duplication of effort. So these processes need to be well defined for differently for orphan indications, or for say you have a targeted therapy, and you know, depending on the landscape and the indication, really. Yeah, I would assume that would be the industry opinion. But again, feel free to drop us a note.
Is the focus of the objection from EU countries voluntary participation of joint clinical assessment? That was the last one that was received.
Yes, so The answer is no. Actually, all the EU countries are in favor of a voluntary participation and in favor of cooperation in HTA. But the issue for some countries is that the joint clinical assessments will be mandatory and that no local or any complementary assessment can be done.
Okay, that appears to be the extent of the questions that we have received through the platform. Rosemary, I don't know if there's any other comments or closing remarks that you wanted to make.
Well, I think I'll just say we've enjoyed doing this, so thanks for the opportunity. And
well, on behalf of HTI, thank you very much for both your presentation and to all of the delegates that attended the session. Very much appreciative to have such a great number of attendees.